Hi, I'm Rory, and with me as always is Ken. How you doing, Ken?
I'm well, thank you for asking, Rory. I'm delighted to be here, and Rory and myself are delighted that you are here, that you're joining us for the Counselling Tutor Podcast, and you're joining us at episode 221. Three topics covered today, starting off with our Counselling Foundations, where we're going to be looking at writing a case study, either as a student, but we're also required to write case studies further on in our professional development. So interesting topic, and I know it sends ice through the veins of many.
Ooh, it does. It does. The hairs on the back of the neck stand up.
We're then going to look at Focus on Self, where we look at you as being the beating heart of your practice. And today we're speaking about taking a break. More on that when we get to that topic. And then we go into Practice Matters, where we dip our toe into what we may come across within our practice. And that can be anything from the business of running a practice through to client presentations. And today we're going to be looking at the power, threat, meaning framework, and we have Dr. Ian Newey, who Rory interviewed. Really, really good. You want to stick around for that. But we're going to start off Counselling Foundations, Rory, writing a case study. My voice is trembling just considering it.
I know, and I think there's nothing that scares or worries students more than having to write a case study, and even thinking about it has brought some mild trauma back from my time as a student when I was presented with this. And I think if you've got some quite easy steps or easy ways of thinking about it, it takes the anxiety off. And the first thing I'd say about writing a case study is always, certainly in counselling, we're always writing it to weave in the theory that we're being taught. The whole point of a case study is to show how you're using the theory to help a client, or a client presents within the theory. So if we just take, say, a person-centered theory, introjected values and conditions of worth, it may be that a client comes and says, well, I have to do as my family says, and I haven't got a voice in my family. And, if I was writing a case study, I might just quote that and then write underneath, this would strongly link into introjected values and conditions of worth. So there's a starter, Ken.
Weave in the theory. I like.
Yes. Yeah.
I when we speak about case studies, I actually think back to a few careers ago when I was working in construction, and we would go in and we would do an installation. And then after doing the installation, we would create a case study. This case study was to evidence what we had done and show other prospective buyers or other people considering maybe putting the same installation in, what the process is and what that looked like, what it was like beforehand, what the process was of putting it in, and what the benefits or changes were as a result afterwards. And a case study within academia is similar to that. We're evidencing and we're showing what happened and what difference happened as a result of what we were doing. And instead of talking about the chemical components that we might have put in the building project or the mechanical components, we're talking here about the theory that we may have used and how that was weaved in and what it was like in the beginning, what the process was like, and what the difference afterwards is. And that is what a case study is all about. And I think it's important to take that 30,000 foot view, to step back from it. That's all it is. We're saying this is how it was, this is what we did, this is how it is now.
Yeah, absolutely, Ken. And I think I'd say that when we're writing case studies, they shouldn't be clinical case studies like we're treating a patient, or indeed building a project. They should involve ourselves and how we've integrated with the therapeutic relationship, and also use the language of therapy. They're not psychological case studies. I remember many years ago when I was teaching in a warding body, and they were very clear that they weren't kind of psychological case studies where we're talking about illness and presentation. We're talking about real living human beings, how they presented, and how we interacted with them using the theories that we were taught to help facilitate a change in them. And one of the things that I was always taught when I wrote case studies was to do a pen portrait of the client. Now, I was so uneducated when I went to my counselling class that I thought you had to draw a picture of the client. And I said to my tutor, I don't think I can draw. And she said to me, no, Rory, she said, it's not drawing. I could see her face now trying to hold back the laughing. And she said, no, she said, you have to write how the client presented. How would I present? What would you write about me? And I think that's really important. It sets the stage. So I might say, Ali was a tall woman with short blonde hair, and she sat in the chair with quite a composed posture, very friendly, very engaging, lots of eye contact. And that would be a pen portrait. It allows the person who's marking it to get a real sense of who this person is, bring the humanity into the discussion.
Yeah, I think that's really important that we're speaking about real people. When we're doing a case study, very often you may be looking to some work you've done with a client, or you may have buddied up to do some simulated sessions to write your case study. But on the other side of a case study is a real person. And I like how you're saying, Rory, to remove that clinical distance and bring the real person in. Who is this person? And I love how you've described the pen portrait. I could see you there busking with your easel up, doing the pen portraits of people coming by. And of course, we talk about pen portrait, and that is a description. Who is this person? Who is this person, so that we can understand them and see the humanity in them as we go through the case study. And of course, this is something that a clinical supervisor would do as well. You know, if you go as a counselor to supervision and you weren't going to be bringing a client, the supervisor would gain an understanding of the humanity or the realness of this person through your frame of reference. So we're engaging in that activity. If you've ever been into supervision, or even if you're still training and you may not have a supervisor, and you may have brought something to professional discussion where you're kind of bringing that person and kind of outlining who they are, that's a great starting point for a case study. I think also the next point on a case study is that case studies are required at different levels of training. You know, you're going to be asked for case studies maybe from level 4 right up. You may even be asked for a case study at level 3, and it's about having a look and asking what is the question. You know, when you're being asked to do a case study is an activity. As we've said, you know, it's a process of showing a series of actions and how it was before, what the series of actions were, and what the outcome is. So that's what a case study is. But within the question, when you're asked to write a case study, they will give you some clues of what they want you to do. And they may use words like evaluate the learning gained, analyze the learning gained, evaluate how this learning informed your work. And these are the words, they're called Bloom's verbs. And Bloom's verbs are the superpowers of tutors and awarding bodies and of those that will mark assignments. That those words require us to do something. So if we're asked to analyze, that's different to being asked to evaluate, which is different to being asked to describe. And I think having an understanding of Bloom's verbs is really, really powerful. So you see the word case study, you then go, right, I kind of know what they want. Then we start going through, take a highlighter and highlight any of the Bloom's verbs. Are they asking you to analyze or to list or to evaluate, and highlight those? Go look them up again and refresh your memory of what does analyze mean. And it's all available on the internet. If you put in Bloom's verbs analyze, it's going to give you a lovely description of what analyze is. And it informs how you write what you're writing. We're still writing the same stuff. We're still writing the same journey, but we're writing it to the criteria or to those Bloom's verbs. So hopefully there's some use for you in that.
Yes, Benjamin Bloom has got a lot to answer for. I met him a lot in my we'll get him in my teaching qualification. And of course, the reason these are asked for is they're testing the level of knowledge. You know, analyze and evaluate our high-level thinking skills. So you're asked to, usually in level 4, but as Ken alluded to, level 3. If you're producing a case study, they want to know how you've maybe applied the theory, your understanding of the theory as it works with the client, and analyze really is to take the separate parts and have a look at them. What what happened with this introjected value? What happened when I used the necessary and sufficient conditions? And then the evaluation really is the outcome. After you've taken those component parts, I always think of it like baking a cake. You talk about the component parts of building the cake, the sugar, the icing, the cake mix, and you go into detail. And then when you put it all together, the evaluation is, how did the cake come out? What did it look like? Did it look like a cake? Did it taste like a cake? And I think that's how it's one way of looking at it. But pay attention to those verbs that are being asked in the case study, because those are the things you'll be marked on. They'll be marking you on the ability to take that information and present it in a way that matches the verb. So if it's analyze, you have to do an analysis. If it's an evaluation, you have to do an evaluation. And I guess my cake analogy is quite a simple one, but I think it gives an idea of analyze and evaluate.
Delicious nonetheless, Rory.
Oh, I like cakes.
Well, I'm imagining it now, and it's chocolate. It's chocolate. It's got lovely chocolate icing on it, and I'm eating it, which would be the end of the case study, the eating part and describing the taste of everything that you've put together. Anyway, moving away from cakes, just
move away from cakes, Ken.
So we're really speaking about now a case study in light of maybe some sessions that you've done with a peer, simulator sessions, or maybe with clients. If you're maybe working towards accreditation, you may be asked for a case study. If you're doing professional qualification post your grad, you may be asked to do a case study on work that you've done there as well. But another area of case study that we're often asked to do is that of supervision-based case study. And the process is exactly the same, but we might be looking to ourselves and what we took into supervision and how that played out in supervision. What were the outcomes of that? What did we use? What did we not use? And what difference did that make? So it's the same journey, but we would be looking to ourselves. We would look into our own supervision and doing the case study related to that topic.
Yeah, absolutely. And I've produced one of my famous super duper handouts. To help you with this. It does reference a specific awarding body, but the language and the questions that are asked usually come up in different awarding bodies. And if you go to podcast episode 221 on the Counselling Tutor website, so go to the Counselling Tutor website, counsellingtutor.com, click the podcast tab, go to 221, and that handout is available for you to download and have a look at. And it's a really good handout because it gives you some really good tips on how to pop a case study together.
Yes, it's I think case studies like building Lego. You've got all the little pieces in front of you, and it's just a matter of taking those pieces and putting them together. And Rory's super duper handout certainly shows some of the different ways to put things together. And I guess as we come to the end of this topic, just to kind of close with the closing of your case study. And of course, you're getting to the end of your case study, you're going to want to present some kind of a conclusion. It's kind of a so what? So I met with this client, we did all of these things, and this is what was presented, and this is the theory that I used, and these are the differences that I saw in the clients. And so, and again, you'd look to what are they asking you in the question. They may ask you to reflect on your learning. What did you take away from this? So there is a conclusion. So you're starting, as Rory put over so nicely, with that pen portrait describing who this person might be, to put a humanity to that. But we're going to be ending it as well, and it just kind of brings everything to a lovely close. And that may be depending on what the question is and what you're asked to write about in your case study, it may be what you take away from this. And the interesting thing when you're looking at your own learning from something is it doesn't always have to be something you did. It can also be something you didn't do. When you're looking back on something, you can say, let's take supervision, for example, and I took this to supervision. My supervisor suggested such and such and such. when I got with the client that no longer seemed appropriate, so I chose not to use it because of such and such and such. So it's not always what we did do. It's also sometimes about what we didn't do. We may say, looking back on that now, maybe I could have used this, and that may have had a different kind of outcome. So it's just that acknowledgement of the closing of your case study.
Yes, and you spoke about reflection, and I think that's really important, Ken, but also reflection, slightly different, reflection. And reflection, being reflexive, is what you would do differently. So reflecting is, well, I could have used this intervention, or maybe if I'd have used a bit more silence, or, that type of thing. Reflexivity is saying, if this presented again, I might do A, B, C, and D differently. And it shows that you've taken the information and that you've reflected on it, and you've thought, this is how I'm going to change my practice. And I think that's really, really important. And being reflexive, I think, is something that's coming up more and more now in case studies. Yeah,
it is very, very much so. So, and if you look into reading the questions, you may see that word reflexive being asked there. Reflective, what was the learning? Reflexive, what are you going to do about it now?
Yes.
What are you going to do? What's the action? So reflect the learning. Reflexive, how are you going to implement? What are you going to do differently going forward? It's the action you're going to take. So we close the case study and we move away from those counselling foundations onto a focus on self, which recognizes you as the heartbeat of your practice. We need to be okay to be there for others that we serve. And today we're talking about when there are times that come up where we may need to walk away. And that can be you're a student and things are getting really, really challenging for you. You may need to defer for a year and then pick up again. We've certainly seen that presentation in our Facebook group, but it can also be that you're qualified, a curveball comes your way, something that is unexpected, and you need to perhaps take a break from practice to look after self so that we don't face too much overwhelm or burnout where we can no longer be in service of those clients. And that came up, Rory, in our Facebook group.
It did, and if you want to join our Facebook group, type Facebook. No, don't
type Facebook into Facebook.
Facebook, don't do that. Type Counselling Tutor into Facebook. You'll find us. We're a closed group. Knock on the door. Our warm and friendly and very supportive moderation team are going to let you in, and you're going to be joining thousands and thousands of like-minded people who talk about the world of counselling and psychotherapy and supervision, all things counselling. And you'll meet students, you'll meet qualified colleagues, and you'll also meet some supervisors. And there's a soup song, a smattering of tutors, all busily discussing topics and sharing information in our group. So come on over and join the party.
Indeed. So that's where the question has come from, and we'd love you to be part of that communication. So looking at that, taking a break, needing a time out. So let's start maybe, Rory, but looking at a student that might be studying, becomes really overwhelming, maybe on a level 4 or level 5, where you're doing multiple years of study. You get to the end of a year and you go, don't feel that I can go on anymore now. I need some time. I need to look at myself.
Yeah, I mean, you talk about curveballs, Ken, and in my experience of tutoring, curveballs such as bereavements, separations, people's jobs stop, or they have to change their jobs and they can no longer accommodate the hours for maybe daytime studies, are all things that can halt people in their tracks. And awarding bodies, in my experience, are usually very, very good. I think you can defer for a year for most awarding bodies. Check with the awarding body. However, some training providers may not be as supportive. So I think you need to be thoughtful. And if you're thinking of going for training, just ask the question, what happens if I have to defer for a year? But it can happen. And I think in qualified practice, I've been talking to colleagues and they've emailed me and said, I've had to step out of practice because I've had some personal difficulties. And you know what, Ken? That's the right thing to do.
100%.
that's the right thing to do. You know, sometimes with personal difficulties, we can be stoic and we can soldier on, if you like. But sometimes our personal difficulties are so present and so big that we have to put ourselves first and our own situation first. And yes, ethically manage our practices and make sure our clients aren't just left. But stepping out isn't a bad thing. It can sometimes be just a case of pure survival, I think.
Yeah, very much so. I mean, we speak about being in service. We're there for our clients. We do what we do so that we can be there for others. But if we're going through our own challenges and our own difficulties, then we're not best able to be there. And whether that's your studies, that you're not able to focus your attention on that, or if you're in practice and you're no longer able to be there for your clients. But it doesn't mean that it's a forever situation. It could be transient. It could be something that would pass over. And it's okay to take some time out. So if you are a qualified practitioner and you're in practice, look to your ethical body, to whoever holds the framework to which you work, National Counselling Society, BACP, UKCP, if you're based in the UK, wherever you are, look to your ethical body, and you will find that there is an allowance for stopping counselling for some time. And I know this because I have my own personal experience. During my journey, a curveball, something I never expected, came along. I received a diagnosis. It was something I did not expect. Some traits started showing in myself. And when I started looking into that, it eventually led down the path to a diagnosis of autism. And that was a massive surprise to me. It kind of rocked my world, and I needed to come to terms with that, come to peace with that, and to look to self and take some time out to kind of rewrite who I was. And I found that my ethical body was understanding of that and were happy for me to step out for a period of time. There is, of course, there is a point in how long you can step out and hold and keep your qualification. So it's just worth checking that with your ethical body.
Yeah, absolutely. And, you know, you speak to your supervisor, take advice, you know, your supervisor, peers. And, you know, I've known lots of people who've just, you know, sometimes people come to the end of it. Our profession is very, very, very demanding. And we work with, you know, very difficult presentations. We hear stories that you wouldn't see, you know, without any disrespect, on a soap opera. You know, I've heard some very, very difficult things as a therapist, and I've known colleagues who've said, I really can't do anymore. I really need to leave that behind and move on. And that's fine. That's really fine. You know, it might be that some people just come to the end of the road. And if that's the case, then, you know, close your practice, you know, go through the professional procedure of closing your practice and, you know, move on to a happy life. I don't think there could be anything worse than soldiering on when your heart and soul isn't in it, and it's damaging you, because self-care is an ethical imperative, isn't it, Ken?
It is. And I love that you've taken that angle on it, Rory, because I guess it's not uncommon in our world today to be unhappy in your job, to go through the motions of going in and doing whatever it is you need to do just to be able to meet the bills. And I guess we don't have that luxury as therapists, as psychotherapists, as counselors, because there's something bigger than us at stake here. When you're in service of another, they kind of come very high up on that priority list. Of course, we come first. We have to look to self first. And that's why we have this focus on self topic in our podcast. And stepping out for a period of time is not a weakness. It is a strength. It is an absolute strength. In the same way as a client presenting for therapy, it's not a weakness. It is an absolute strength that should be saluted and celebrated, that client reaches out. And often it can be seen by self as a weakness. I can't carry on. I can't even manage my practice anymore. but it's a great strength in recognizing that need to put a little bit of distance between you. And of course, it goes into self-care of having regular breaks. And as you said, Rory, speaking it through with your supervisor, speaking it through with some peers, checking with your ethical body, checking with your insurer, going through the process. You said, Rory, professionally kind of bringing that practice to an end. It's not just a dead stop. We do need to manage that process, but we do it, I guess, in service of our clients at the end of the day. Because if we're not there and we're not good for ourselves, then how does that contaminate our relationship with our clients?
Absolutely. And I think it speaks to wisdom as well. I think that people who make these decisions, they're displaying wisdom. They're saying, by carrying on, I'm going to damage myself, and therefore I'm going to damage, therefore I could damage a client. So yes, and I think it's really important that if you listen to this, you might think, oh, well, this sounds like what we're at the position I'm in at the moment. Yeah. It does speak to wisdom, and it does speak to doing the right thing. And as long as you close your practice down, you make sure that you follow the steps. Lots of ethical bodies have steps that guide how to stop your practice and what to do with the data as well, because you've collated data through the years, notes and contact details. What do you do with that? That needs to be dealt with. But if you're going down that road, if you do it properly, you can move away from it. You can always come back, within a specified time, but you maybe give you that space to, look at your life a bit more holistically, decide what your next moves are. It's so important. I don't think anybody in our profession should go past the point where they're burnt out, because I think there lies tragedy, to be honest, Ken.
Indeed. And what's interesting is I guess we get a ringside seat in Counselling Tutor. Rory and myself are in a privileged position in that we're involved in the journey of many thousands of students becoming counsellors, and many thousands of counsellors who are taking further professional development and training. And it is not uncommon for us to hear of individuals coming back and going back into formal training after maybe taking 5 years away. I used to counsel. I needed to move away for whatever reasons that were, and I'm coming back now. And what's really interesting to me, Rory, is in kind of, and I guess I don't want to generalize here, but in kind of speaking to some of those individuals, the light seems to burn very brightly when they do return. The passion seems to burn very brightly when they do return. And I can only imagine when you're stepping away, maybe that light has dimmed. Maybe it's not as bright. And of course, that's not always the case. It can be external circumstances beyond your control that may mean that you need to step away from practice. We don't, life is life, and we don't get to control what comes our way, but we do get to control how we act and react within those circumstances. That's the only thing we have any control of. And sometimes the right thing is to step down.
Absolutely, Ken. And I get letters in the mailbox from time to time with people saying exactly that. And and I write back to them and I say, if you've written this letter or this email to me, it shows that at some level you've got some intent. And you're asking my advice. Well, my advice would be listen to yourself, listen to your heart, and how is it going to benefit you? How is it going to benefit you? And people could write back and they go, I never thought of it that way. And I think it really speaks to the fact that a lot of therapists and, most of my wider network believe they're in service to clients. They believe they're in service to clients. And we are. But also, to be in service, we need to be in service to ourselves. I always say selfish gets a bad press. And sometimes just thinking of ourselves and saying, I just need to look after self, I think is wise. I think it's prudent. And I think if that is how you feel, it should be acted on sooner rather than later.
And there it is. Focus on self. And we now move into practice matters. where we dip our toe into the world that is practice. And we bring a whole lot of different topics when we speak about practice matters. But today is a really, really interesting topic. I think you're going to get a lot from this. But before we go into that, and before Rory kind of introduces this topic, I excitedly say that we have a brand new sponsor who has joined us on the Counselling Tutor Podcast, who is proudly sponsoring Practice Matters, and that is the National Counselling Society. And you'll hear just a little bit more about that in just a moment or two. But firstly, what can we expect from Practice Matters? I know, Rory, that you met up with Dr. Ian Newey to look over the power, threat, meaning framework. And what I do know is that afterwards you were bubbling with excitement. You, in a leadership team meeting, were saying how amazing this interview was and the content that came from that.
I read a book. I read the occasional book. It comes as no surprise, possibly, called A Straight Talking Introduction to the Power, Threat, Meaning Framework by Mary Boyle and Lucy Johnstone. And this is a framework of destigmatizing people who've got mental health diagnoses. Sometimes, when we hear bipolar, schizophrenia, clinical depression, sometimes they feel like a brick wall. And the power, threat, meaning framework is an antidote to that. It's an absolute antidote to it. And it asks us to consider the people as humans, not a diagnosis. And there are a series of questions that we can use so that we can engage with people and ask the meaning and what power is at play within their lives that may make them into the position where they're unwell. And Lucy Johnstone very kindly referred me to her colleague, Dr. Ian Newey, or Ian, as he likes to be called. He's a wonderful man. And he met up with me. And this is what he had to say about the power, threat, meaning framework. And I'm joined today by Dr. Ian Newey, who's a consultant clinical psychologist. And we're going to be discussing a really influential book, The Power, Threat, Meaning Framework, written by Lucy Johnstone and Mary Boyle, about how we destigmatize diagnosis and see our clients as real human beings who've had experience. So, Dr. Ian Newey, welcome.
Hello.
So, I've read the Power, Threat, Meaning Framework, and one of the things that I took away from that is that sometimes we can cut ourselves off as clinicians when we hear a diagnosis that I've been diagnosed with schizophrenia, I've been diagnosed with bipolar. And the book alludes to the fact that once that happens, we don't actually see the whole person and the whole person's experience.
Absolutely. I think that diagnosis is one way of looking at mental distress, and it works quite well, the concept of diagnosis, when we look at physical illness, but trying to apply the same lens to look at thoughts and feelings and emotions. It's not quite as simple as that. And a diagnosis isn't an answer. It's a particular set of patterns that have been put together by a committee. And if you look at the ICD, the International Classification of Diseases, and the DSM, the Diagnostic Statistical Manual, both of which are used in Europe and in America, respectively, those diagnoses have increased many times over the different editions. And again, if you look at where the diagnoses come from, they have groups of psychiatrists who have got a vested interest in continuing this way of thinking about mental distress, who will vote on whether it should be a diagnosis or not. So it's not an answer. They've been looking for biological markers of mental distress for decades, and they haven't found them yet. which kind of implies that it's a bit more sophisticated than they would have us believe.
Yeah, I think we talked earlier before we started recording, and one of the things that you were saying was that if somebody has a physical illness, and I'll use the analogy of a heart complaint, that could actually be seen. It could actually be, you could actually, do an X-ray or a scan, or, you could do some tests, and you can say that's what's wrong, and this is what we're going to do with, and I use the term just for the podcast, mental distress or mental illness. It's more of an opinion, isn't it? It's more of someone taking opinion on what's been said to them, and then from what's been said, they form an opinion and say, well, that sounds like, and then they can put the label on it. Would that be a good summary, a useful summary?
Yeah, absolutely. It's the imposition of a set of pre-existing ideas on someone's lived experience. So it's, but equally, two people can have the same diagnosis and not have the same inverted commas symptoms, and even the language of symptoms, it kind of implies that it's connected to illness, and the illness model just doesn't really fit for mental distress, because you don't catch a mental illness. It is something that happens to people following adverse life circumstances or adverse life events. So we're going to be talking about the power threat meaning framework, which is and it makes the most fundamental shift from what is wrong with you to what has happened to you. It's about contextualizing distress. And again, before we started recording, we were talking about the pandemic of mental illness that has followed the COVID-19 pandemic. The mental health services are overflowing. They can't meet demand. And either there is some kind of unknown physical link between the COVID-19 virus and mental distress and low mood and anxiety, or maybe the social isolation, the job losses, the financial implications of that, and the fact that people have been dying. That's had an impact on people. So I think that it's about the circumstances that people are living through.
Yes, it speaks to the social events that surround us and the events that happen in society impact on people's emotional and mental well-being. And you talked earlier about being careful not to pathologize normal human behavior, because sometimes we have to experience, I would say, for instance, loss. We have to experience loss because that is a natural process of adapting to a new reality.
Indeed. I use the example of my dad, who I love very much. And if he were to die, I would be hugely distressed. I would be very, very upset. And that is a normal response to distress. But there's something about the pathologizing of experience that means that if I was spending a lot of time crying, if I was struggling to get up, then people say, you've got depression, there's something wrong with you. But that would be a normal response to circumstances. If I lost my job, I may become very anxious. If my wife became profoundly unwell, then that would have an impact on me. That doesn't mean that suddenly the neurotransmitters, that there's a chemical imbalance in my brain. And actually, this is a story that is often told in psychiatry, the chemical imbalance story. There's no evidence to suggest that that's true. Again, even psychiatrists aren't telling that story anymore. It was a story about medicalizing mental distress. but it doesn't fit. And if we start to think about the societal and social factors that have led to someone feeling the way they do, then I often think about it like a maze. Sometimes if you're given a diagnosis, it's like you've been plonked in the middle of a maze and you don't know how you've got there. Whereas if you explore the social and psychological factors and the circumstances that led to it, it's almost like you understand how you've got there, which can help someone find a way out of where they've got to.
Yes, and I think it kind of brings us neatly to the questions that the power threat meaning framework use to move away from the typical question of what is wrong with you, and maybe to go into the question as what's happened to you. And one of the things when I read the book was this made complete sense to me, because you're trying to enter someone's lived experience, trying to make sense of how they came to be where they are, meeting them where they are. So what are these questions, and how useful are they from the terms of the service user or the client?
Okay, there are some core questions in the power threat meaning framework, and they're covered not only in the document that's on the British Psychological Society website, but also in the book that you're making reference to, which is the Straight Talking Introduction to the Power Threat Meaning Framework, written by Lucy Johnstone and Mary Boyle, that I'm going to refer to now, because I just want to make sure that I get it absolutely right. So instead of asking what's wrong with me, ask what's happened to me. So there are questions that the Power Threat Meaning Framework, or PTMF, expand this into, and they ask what's happened to you, and that can be expanded in how is power operating in your life. And power is a core feature of the PTMF, and it's not just about the power that has been exerted on you. And we think about the impact of poverty, we think about the impact of education or lack of education, we think about race and racism, and we think about certain people who are given many more opportunities than others. And I've got power in that I've got doctor in front of my name. I'm a white, middle-aged, middle-class male, which means that I've got tremendous amounts of power. And some people from different demographics, they wouldn't have access to that power. And that there are societal and ideological power that's influenced that puts people in a position on a hierarchy of power. And so people have got access to their own power resources, but also power can be exerted upon them through abuse, neglect, family relationships, all sorts of things. Anyway, so that's just the first question. So the second question is, how did it affect you? So that's what kind of threats did it pose? And that's about exploring, if we take race as an example. I'm reading a brilliant book by David Harewood at the moment, who has got some lived experience as a black man growing up in Birmingham, which is where I'm from. And the racism that he faced there, it was a genuine threat to him, to his physical self, to his sense of identity, to his sense of being. It's incredible. Then the next question, what sense do you make of it? And I think that the attributions that we make about our experiences are also really important. So what was the meaning that you took from that? I mean, it's the meaning in the Power Threat Meaning Framework. An example that I often use is when I was knocked off a motorcycle, and in a fairly spectacular way, was my fault, officer. I said I was incredibly lucky, because it was a low-sided vehicle. I went flying over the top and landed, and I just pureed my wrist and I had a bang on the head. Someone else may have made a very different attribution and may have said, I was very unlucky in that I wasn't doing anything wrong, and this car turned across my path and I was very significantly injured. And that would have a very different impact on your narrative, your story of your life. And the PTMF is very interested in narratives, very interested in stories, personal narratives, really important. And we need to listen to the client's, service users' experience. I'm steering away from the use of the word patient here.
Yes.
Because again, it puts someone into a position of passivity. And then we start asking the question, what do you have to do to survive? And now this is where the idea about symptoms comes in, because these are often threat responses, the things that people have done in order to survive these adverse life experiences and the adverse life circumstances. It's not just all about the life events. It's sometimes about the circumstances that can continue for long periods of time. And then I'm mindful of time. I know I've spent ages doing this, but one of the things that I think mental health systems often don't do very well is ask about strengths, and it's a very important bit to ask about strengths. What access to pararesources do you have? What are you good at? What helps you? What relationships have you got? And it's about kind of moving beyond those neoliberal ideas about what it is to be good and valid. It's not about whether you've got a good job, but it's about your relationships. It's about your caring responsibilities. It's about kind of widening the idea of validity as well. And then to integrate all of the above, what is your story? And that is the most fundamental thing of the power threat meaning framework, finding out someone's story. And we shouldn't be closed down by, oh, well, I've got psychosis in inverted commas. Oh, I've got schizophrenia in inverted commas. Oh, I've got an emotionally unstable personality disorder. That's a personal diagnosis, can cause distress. And I think that as mental health professionals, as people who working with people to try and care for them, we probably shouldn't be doing things that make them worse.
Yes. I mean, I was absolutely riveted by the book, and it kind of struck me as a therapist that this is the kind of thing that therapists do all the time. We should be seeing past the diagnosis and seeing the person and their story and their lived experience. And I don't know if you'd agree with me, but I think there lies the therapeutic path, as opposed to putting a big full stop and saying, this is you, and that's where you are forever. There's the diagnosis, and that's the label.
Yes. I've said before, the diagnosis is not an answer. The diagnosis closes down questions, and what we want to do is we want to open things up, because the purpose of therapy is to bring about change. And if you lock someone into a diagnosis, and I have heard people say, I'd really like to be able to do that, but I can't because I've got emotionally unstable personality disorder, and without acknowledging that the cluster of difficulties that they're experiencing, about having a difficulty trusting people, feeling overwhelmed by their emotions, for example, not being able to tolerate distress. That comes from the fact that they've got a life of trauma, invalidation, being taught that they're not important, and of course they don't trust people. And of course, when things go wrong, they expect them to go catastrophically wrong, because that's what their experience has taught them. Now, if you get a story and you understand that they've got a number of responses to the threats that are being posed in their lives, we can think with them once you've understood the etiology, the way that the responses have been constructed. You can ask, are these useful for you now? Are there different stories that you can tell? And we can start to move towards more psychological flexibility, as people like Steve Hayes and Russ Harris would talk about in the acceptance and commitment therapy literature. It's about flexibility and moving on towards I guess a life worth living. If we're, if I'll quote Marshall Linehan as well, because everyone can move towards a life worth living, and that hope of change and of experiencing the distress in life, but also finding joy and beauty. We've got to hold that for them, even if the people with whom we're meeting can't see that for themselves at the time.
Well, Ian, as you've asked me to call you, I think life worth living is probably a apt place to finish this interview. It's been really enlightening, totally refreshing. So Ian Newey, Dr. Ian Newey, thank you very much.
Thank you as always to Dr. Ian Newey, or Ian, as he likes to be called, as you mentioned. Rory, thank you very much, Ian. And of course, thank you to Rory for hosting that interview, for making that happen, reading the book, reaching out. And I really do. I take my hat off. If I was wearing one, and if you're watching this on our YouTube podcast, you'll see that I don't wear a hat. But if I was wearing one, I would tip it to you, Rory, because really good topic. And you do the work in finding the topics and getting the experts to speak on that. Very, very grateful. And of course, this has been episode 221 of the Counselling Tutor Podcast.
Yeah, so we started off by talking in Counselling Foundations about how to write a case study, and we talked about Benjamin Bloom's verbs and gave some overview on the things you might need to consider. Focus on Self was about taking a break, what happens when we need to put self-care into our lives and maybe step away from our practice and rejuvenate ourselves and take care of self. And then in Practice Matters, I met up with Dr. Ian Newey and we talked about the power, threat, meaning framework, a new set of thinking in the world of mental health, and one I think that's very much overdue and is going to be of so much benefit to those people who sadly don't have the best mental health. And as always, stay grounded and please stay safe.